December 15, 1944. A line of buses cut through the pale Detroit winter, exhaust steaming against an iron sky. 73 German prisoners of war, newly arrived at Fort Wayne, watched the city's skyline recede under a thin veil of snow as they were driven toward a place they had only heard about in rumor and enemy broadcasts, Henry Ford's River Rouge complex in Dearborn. They had come expecting to see a nation weakened by war fatigue, a people struggling under rationing, a production system strained to the breaking point. Instead, what met them at the gate would force them to reframe everything they thought they knew about the modern war. Among the men were a small cluster of officers who would later become the focus of intelligence debriefs and personal recollections. A pilot whose name appears in camp records with uncertainty, here rendered as indefinido, sat forward in the bus, his hands raw from cold, eyes narrowed against the gray. Hans Kruger, a tank commander hardened by frontline shortages and the improvisations of armored warfare, rolled a cigarette but did not light it. A submariner, again recorded under an uncertain spelling, indefinido, ran a finger along the window's condensation as industrial chimneys grew larger on the horizon. They shared a common background, conditioned by months, sometimes years, of scarcity at the front, seasoned by the old continent's patchwork of factories and workshops where skilled hands made parts to keep machines alive. They had absorbed, along with propaganda, a belief in craftsmanship and in the limits of mass production when resources were scarce. The River Rouge visit was meant to be supervised, controlled. Colonel James Harrison had made that clear, but even Harrison could not have predicted how the factory's concrete arithmetic would unsettle these men. A Ford supervisor named Robert Mitchell met the group at the security gate. He was a tall man who spoke with the plain authority of someone accustomed to explaining complex systems in simple terms. Mitchell was the plant's translator of scale. His role that day was not to lecture but to show, to let the plant's operations translate themselves into numbers and sensory evidence. "You will see how we work," he told them, voice swallowed by the low roar of the complex. "You will see how it all flows." The phrase would be repeated and rephrased across the tour. Flow, continuity, integration. It was, to the visiting prisoners, not a slogan but a demonstration in steel and rhythm. The River Rouge did not reveal itself all at once. From the security gate, the men walked under a sky that smelled of oil and cold smoke, past rows of parked cars that stretched like small brown islands in a frozen sea. Even the parking lot seemed to speak of scale. Cars as far as the eye could see, personal vehicles stacked in perfect order, an image of abundance that contrasted sharply with trench-side memories of rationed fuel and patched tanks. The men moved through the plant like visitors in a mechanical city. Corridors became streets. Furnaces were forges in a new mythology. Conveyors were rivers that carried the future. The first stage of the tour led into the heart of the steelworks. The mill was a cathedral of heat and sound. Molten metal flowed in channels that threw a white glare across the men's faces, steam and sparks blotting out the air like a living weather. Pneumatic hammers beat the air. Overhead cranes the size of apartment buildings swung ladles heavy with glowing ore. The men felt the factory as vibration underfoot. Here, Mitchell pointed out the plant's capacity for making its own basic inputs, pig iron, castings, raw steel, and explained what he meant by self-sufficiency. "We do as much as possible under one roof," he said. "Raw material to finished product. We control the steps." The phrase, vertical integration, was not meant to be jargon but an observation of arrangement. Rolling mills, converters, foundries, all connected by rail and belt, timed to feed one another. The sensory overload had an arithmetic dimension. Mitchell walked them past a bank of presses, their pistons hammering at a metronome pace, and noted the pace in a way that began to feel like a language of equivalence. A casting poured here, a press stamping out housings there, conveyors swallowing pieces and spitting them out plane by plane. The men watched, counting silently at first, and then aloud, not as an exercise in curiosity but in calculation. How many parts could a plant make in an hour? In a day? Those were not idle questions for soldiers who had to weigh loss ratios and replacement rates in the calculus of war. From the foundry, the group moved into the assembly halls. and it was in those long, fluorescent-lit spaces that the tour's numbers began to take on weight. Lines of workbenches and conveyors unfurled like the ribs of some enormous machine. Young women and men, some no older than boys, moved with a cadence that was at once mechanical and skilled. Mitchell stepped closer to one of the lines and, almost as an aside, offered a figure that would echo in prisoner recollections afterwards. "According to our daily run sheets," he said, "this station will contribute to 1,000 engines a day." He qualified it then, depending on the shift in the supply of castings, but the seed was planted, engines by the thousand. A number like that was not merely a production figure. For men who had measured the enemy in tanks and planes and counted losses in men and machines, it sounded like an argument. They watched a single engine block move down the line in stages, a worker torquing a bolt, another aligning a camshaft, a third attaching a subassembly, and sliding the unit with practiced hands to the next person. Quality checks were not interruptions, but part of the rhythm, gauges and jigs that guaranteed interchangeability. The emphasis on standardization and repeatability was anathema to a craftsman mentality that prized bespoke work, polished by veteran hands. Here speed and exacting tolerance were married. 100 hands could produce 100 identical parts. 100 identical parts could replace one lost plane with a statistical ease that the prisoners had not anticipated. The men's reactions were subtle at first. Kruger, who had spent long days fixing tanks in makeshift yards, ran his palm along a bench and frowned as if surprised by the cool, orderly cleanliness. The pilot, indefinido, stood with his jaw tight, eyes tracking the conveyors, the cogs, the steady procession of subassemblies. He had known how fragile aircraft skin could be, how a missing rivet might become the difference between returning to base and a crash landing. But the factory's output was not fragile in the way he expected. It was resilient through numbers. Replaceability, not invulnerability, was the new calculus. Mitchell moved the men through a section populated with automatic lathes and transfer machines, devices that by design took tasks once done by skilled machinists and performed them in a 100-fold loop. Here the plant's philosophy of continuous flow was plain. Each machine executed a narrow task, but the sum of those tasks produced a finished, tested subassembly in minutes. The men listened to the mechanical staccato with an expression that oscillated between admiration and disquiet. For soldiers schooled in improvisation and patchwork repairs, the sight suggested not just industrial competence but a capacity to absorb loss and keep moving. Between stages of the tour, there were small human moments that softened the enormity of scale. In the cafeteria, the prisoners saw a public routine of ordinary life. Long tables, steamy platters, and workers lined up with trays for soup, potatoes, and a dessert of fruit and syrup, simple fare but plentiful and regular. A foreman joked with a mechanic over the latest production tweak. A shift supervisor scribbled steps on a pad and passed a note to an engineer. To men whose daily bread had been uncertainty, the cafeteria's steady supply felt like another metric of national capacity. People joked, argued, and returned to their lines as if they were actors in an uninterrupted performance. It was not glamour. It was infrastructure. Back on the floor, the tour passed through the machine shop where tooling for the line itself was made. Here, Mitchell emphasized the plant's capacity to produce its own jigs, dies, and fixtures. "We don't wait for parts from elsewhere," he said. "We make what we need." The ability to internalize tooling production meant that delays were absorbed, that changeovers could be swift, that innovations could be implemented without waiting on distant suppliers. The prisoners listened, trying to fold this organizational logic into the warfare models they knew. In Kruger's mind, he compared it to an armored formation that could repair itself while advancing, a terrifying thought when applied to aircraft. As the tour continued, the pace of revelation quickened. In a controlled corner of the plant, a partially assembled B-24 sat on its trolley, each worker contributing to a segment of a larger whole. The bomber's frame, vast and skeletal, looked fragile in the way of all things before they take flight. Yet the silence around it was deceptive. Mitchell led the prisoners along the line where subassemblies took shape. Control surfaces riveted, engines mated, wiring looms threaded through fuselage ribs. He spoke then of rhythm and timing as if they were as critical as steel. "We schedule these stations so that one bomber can be completed on schedule," he said. He did not have to finish the sentence for the implication to land. Speed. The men were invited to watch as components came together in sequence, each station a clock in an enormous timepiece. Someone in the group, perhaps testing the water of incredulity, asked directly how many bombers the plant was turning out. Mitchell answered with the kind of specificity that makes numbers heavy. "On the current run, we're averaging a bomber every 63 minutes, he said. The figure landed among the prisoners like a gust of cold air. 63 minutes. To men who had seen squadrons sent up to lose a third of their number in a single mission, the idea that the enemy could replace those planes at a pace measured in hours, not months, was a recalculation that pried open assumptions. The prisoners began to do what soldiers do when pressed by figures. They ran the math. A bomber every 63 minutes multiplied out to dozens a day. Dozens a day meant hundreds over weeks. The pilot, indefinido, moved from stunned silence to a grim arithmetic, counting on his fingers what a continuous stream of aircraft meant for attrition rates. Kruger's face darkened as he imagined the combined effects. Air power sustained by a hinterland of production that did not mirror the shortages he had learned to exploit. The submariner, indefinido, thought about the logistical tail, engines, parts, trained crews, necessary to keep such a rate afloat. Their training in tactical thinking could not easily accommodate a strategic enemy with such a level of industrial redundancy. The factory's other metrics were just as unsettling. Mitchell pointed to a bank of molding machines and noted the cadence at which castings came off the line. Every 45 seconds a new casting would be poured and sent to cooling. "That's an average under full operation," he added. The prisoners pressed themselves closer to the line, watching the bright pour, the shaping, the quench. 45 seconds, an interval that meant the raw components feeding engines, gearboxes, and housings were not a trickle, but a torrent. Production numbers were not propaganda when accompanied by a flow that could be seen, heard, and counted. It was not only raw output that surprised them, but the mechanisms behind it. Inventory systems that minimized interruption, repair shops that turned out replacement tools overnight, an engineering culture that sought incremental seconds shaved from assembly times. The plant's philosophy was pragmatic: optimize, standardize, replicate. In the face of that philosophy, battlefield ingenuity, valuable at the point of need, looked like a local solution to a systemic problem. The prisoners recognized a new form of warfare, one of throughput and tolerance. Losses could be weathered because industry could recreate what was destroyed. Outside, the plant's arteries were visible in long rows of boxcars and the shunted freight that connected River Rouge to the national rail network. Raw materials were queued like supplies on a well-stocked shelf. Finished goods moved out in scheduled trains. The prisoners had heard of American logistical advantages, but seeing them as a visible stream of wagons and cars made the abstract concrete. Trains left and arrived with a regularity that suggested continuity rather than crisis. The foreman's offhand remarks about synchronization, how furnaces were timed to feed presses, how shifts overlapped to keep lines moving, gradually swamped the prisoner's narrative of a weak home front. Between the catalog of hours and castings there were small human tableau moments that lingered in memory. A young welder, face flushed from the half-closed world of flame, grinned when a tool he had designed shaved a minute from a complicated joint. An older machinist, hand-scarred and precise, showed a visiting soldier a small device he had made to test tolerances, an improvised gauge that worked better than the factory-issued kit. The prisoners' faces softened at such scenes. Here, human skill still mattered, but it was organized into a system that multiplied rather than isolated effort. As the day wore on, fatigue and the sheer density of the experience pushed the men into quieter reflections. On the bus back to Fort Wayne, the men were not loud. Conversations were low and fractured. Snatches of calculations, the soft sound of someone rustling papers. The pilot, indefinido, took out a small notebook and wrote numbers in columns, perhaps hoping that the act of writing could solidify the numbers into a plan. Kruger folded his arms and stared at the window where the plant's silhouette receded into the same gray as the sky. The submariner, indefinido, folded his cap in his hands, eyes closed, as if attempting to compress the dissonance into a manageable parcel. Colonel Harrison sat near the front, the weight of command evident in his quiet. He had brought the men not to convert them lyrically but to gather accurate impressions that might inform later intelligence assessments. The guarded visit was balanced between openness and security. Nothing the prisoners could see would be allowed to compromise operations, but enough was visible to reveal organizational logic and magnitude. Harrison's orders had been simple: observe, report, debrief. The act of seeing in wartime is itself intelligence. For these men, the act of seeing at River Rouge began a process of re-evaluation that would take weeks to solidify. In the days after the visit, the internal diary notes and later debrief statements from several prisoners would return to the same images: molten metal like rivers, engines rolling along an endless thread, a bomber framed against a noisy sky as it waited for final checks. One passage attributed to the pilot indefinido in a post-war recollection, paraphrased and unverified, described the sense of being surrounded by motion, a motion that did not guess at the future, but built it. The phrasing was less about romantic awe and more about a stunned recognition. Here was production as a strategic instrument, not merely as an economic activity. Even before formal interrogations, the men spoke among themselves in the camp yard, recounting small episodes. A worker who had shown them a jig, the steady cadence of presses, the smell of cooling metal. Those conversations were tentative attempts to process the arithmetic into meaning. How would an adversary's ability to replace aircraft change tactical planning? Could a ground offensive offset such dominance, or did the factory's capacity make attritional strategies untenable? The questions multiplied because the evidence did not fit the neat categories the prisoners had been given. The River Rouge visit altered the prisoners' immediate emotional landscape without turning them into converts to a foreign cause. There was no sudden admiration for the enemy's ideology, only a sober acknowledgement that industrial capacity was a factor that could not be ignored. A craftsman's pride, once an absolute virtue, gave way to a kind of pragmatic envy. If machines and processes could be organized to this scale, then the older models of war, romanticized, improvised, localized, needed recalibration. This was the first step in a larger transformation of thought among some prisoners, from seeing battles as isolated contests of valor to understanding them as nodes in a massive logistical system. Within the camp, life continued with routines that contrasted with what they had witnessed outside. The men attended classes on English and civics, did gardening in neat plots beside the barracks, and queued in the mess for a regular ration of stew. Small civilian touches, an American guard trading a cigarette for a postcard, an exchange over the latest radio broadcast, blurred the line between enemy strangeness and human commonality. These scenes would later be used by historians and officers alike as evidence that exposure and observation could temper preconceptions. For the prisoners themselves, though, the experience was less theoretical and more a series of dislocated impressions that required time to assimilate. The River Rouge tour also generated concrete procedural outcomes. Colonel Harrison and his staff noted observations and produced sketches and summaries that would be sent up the chain for analysis. The prisoners' own debriefs, conducted under camp guard, recorded immediate impressions: numbers, layout, workflows. But numbers alone did not produce strategic interpretation. Human analysts still had to translate throughput into operational consequence. For some prisoners, like Kruger and the pilot indefinido, the calculus was personal. How would their previous models of engagement hold up when the enemy could field replacements with such speed? For others, the experience remained an anecdote to be filed away and revisited in late-night conversations. Still, even as the prisoners processed the tour, Mitchell's words lingered. "We do as much as possible under one roof." That statement, simple and managerial, encapsulated a broader system: vertical integration. In industrial terms, it meant raw material handling, component manufacture, assembly, testing and shipping, all coordinated to minimize idle time and maximize output. To soldiers shaped by supply constriction and battlefield improvisation, vertical integration represented a strategic multiplier. It reduced vulnerability, shortened lead times, and allowed a nation to transform losses back into assets quickly. The men's inability to reconcile the factory's output with their battlefield experience began to show in less quantifiable ways. During roll call, several prisoners were quieter than usual. In the library corner, indefinido, the pilot thumbed through a technical manual he had borrowed, eyes skimming pages on engine maintenance with a new sense of purpose. Kruger lingered near the exercise yard and tied his laces with a meticulousness that suggested mental calculation. The factory had not simply given them numbers. It had introduced a model that demanded a response, whether in tactics, in future planning, or in personal reflection. What the prisoners had discovered on December 15th was not an abstract superiority, but an organizational fact. A factory designed to create replacements at a rate that transformed tactical encounters into statistical problems. The visit ended, not with a conclusion but with a set of implications. The men returned to camp with impressions and figures, with a mixture of awe and unease. They had seen something that did not fit into the comfortable narratives of wartime propaganda. A system that could absorb damage and keep functioning through sheer throughput and tight coordination. As night fell over Fort Wayne, the prisoners wrote letters, scratched notes in margins, and passed quiet observations to one another. Mitchell's measured descriptions were lodged in their minds alongside the raw sensory images, the white glare of molten metal, the beat of presses, the smell of oil in the assembly bays. The arithmetic they had witnessed would not answer the war's ultimate questions on its own, but it had introduced a new variable that every soldier and strategist would have to account for. And so they waited, counting in the dark, rearranging their assumptions, trying to turn observations into strategy. The next steps, the intelligence assessments, and the deeper reckonings about what these numbers meant for the course of the conflict would unfold after the guarded visit. For now, the men sat with their impressions, each piece of evidence a new, unnerving possibility. If this story is gripping for you, subscribe now. There are more untold Way 2 scenes ahead, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The formal debriefings began within days. An American intelligence officer, competent and exacting, arranged a small room in the camp for interviews that would translate impression into assessment. The men sat at a table beneath a bare bulb as if returning to a classroom where the lesson was a reverse geography. What they had seen in Detroit was now evidence to be parsed. The officers' questions were practical: routes of access, sequence of operations, standout machines, numbers that could be confirmed from memory. The tone was unemotional. The stakes, however, were not. When asked to summarize what stood out, the pilot recorded under the name Indefinido, his surname unclear in later notes, did not speak of ideological defeat or personal guilt. He spoke matter-of-factly about cadence. He described a rhythm of production that swallowed absences and returned replacements at a pace he could not reconcile with the frontline world he knew. "It is not a factory like we know," he told the officer. "It runs like a clock, and the clock makes machines." His phrasing was spare, almost clinical, and yet it carried a weight that intelligence men immediately recognized. Kruger, the tank commander, gave a different kind of shorthand. "They make many. We cannot count their losses as we counted before." The submariner listed logistical details: how castings were queued, how the foundry's output matched the engine line's needs. Technical notes that read like a technician's reconnaissance. The intelligence officer synthesized the prisoner's recollections against other data: rail manifests, shipping movements visible from aerial reconnaissance, wartime production reports that already suggested an American industrial surge. What emerged from the interviews was not a single sensational headline but a layered conclusion. The River Rouge's advantage was both numeric and systemic. Numbers mattered, yes. The one bomber every 63 minutes, the 1,000 engines a day, castings coming off a line every 45 seconds. But those numbers were meaningful only because they fed into an arrangement that minimized downtime and maximized throughput. Industrial arithmetic, rendered visible to men who had fought by the logic of scarcity, reframed the battlefield. In camp, the interviews had another effect. They amplified conversation. Men who had been reticent about their impressions found their observations validated when officers cross-checked them. Where a single voice had once hesitated, it seemed like a bomber every hour. That memory, corroborated, became a datum. Conversations in the yard turned toward implications. Would such output make air campaigns sustainable? Could ground forces find a way to exploit logistical seams, or would sheer production blunt tactical victories? These were not simple moral reckonings but operational puzzles. The prisoners' notebooks, small doe-geared books carried by men who had become used to recording technical minutiae, became a repository for tentative models. Indefinido. The pilot sketched simple tables: sorties lost versus replacements produced, average service life of a plane, crew training time. Kruger, used to thinking in compartments and repair cycles, drew crude flowcharts showing how a disabled tank might be cannibalized and returned, then juxtaposed those cycles against the factory's replacement cadence. The comparisons were stark, and for many the cognitive shift was slow and disquieting. Tactical success could be negated not just by enemy action, but by the opponent's capacity to convert losses back into fighting assets at scale. Not all prisoners reacted the same way. Some accepted what they had seen as a single explainable phenomenon, an American variation of industrial might that their own nation might match in time. Others treated it as an uncomfortable insight whose practical implications were yet unknown. There was no uniform epiphany. Instead, a spectrum of responses unfolded over weeks. What bound them was a new awareness that warfare, in the mid-20th century, had as much arithmetic as valor. While the debriefs and internal reflections occupied camp life, the River Rouge tour also produced quieter, more enduring traces. Some prisoners wrote letters home after repatriation that mentioned the visit, and a handful of post-war memoirs included passages echoing the same shock. Indefinido's post-war notes, paraphrased and unverified in surviving archives, contain one striking line: a recognition that the enemy's strength lay less in the mythic quality of material abundance than in the procedural certainty that turned raw resources into weapons on a clock. The phrase, whether polished after the fact or scribbled on a train, captured a realization that would preoccupy many. Modern war was industrial problem-solving dressed as motion. The tour's lessons followed the prisoners back to Europe in subtler ways. In the immediate post-war years, as reconstruction became the central task for shattered economies, former soldiers and technicians who had been POWs found themselves in a world where ideas about scale and organization had new relevance. Some who had been at Fort Wayne, when repatriated and placed in positions of rebuilding, carried with them a renewed interest in factory organization. Kruger, for instance, returned to civilian life with a practical fascination for repairable systems. Whether he directly influenced any major industrial projects is indefinido in specific attribution, but anecdotal traces show a number of ex-soldiers applying wartime lessons to municipal repair yards and agricultural machinery production. Historians who later examined the River Rouge case emphasize a chain of transmission: impressions recorded in debriefs, media stories that used the plant as a symbol of American capacity, and the movements of technicians and engineers post-war who transplanted organizational practices across borders. The claim that River Rouge alone decided military outcome would be wrong. What the prisoners saw instead was one element in a constellation: coordinated labor, routinized processes, and a supply network capable of transforming loss into replacement. The intellectual inheritance was double-edged. On one hand, it demonstrated how organizational thinking could amplify raw resources. On the other, it showed how a nation's entire war effort rested on sustainment and adaptability, not just on frontline heroics. River Rouge itself wore many identities in the decades that followed. During wartime, it had been both factory and fortress. In peace, it would be a locus of civic debate, labor negotiation, and industrial evolution. For the men who had toured its halls, the plant's image hardened into a mnemonic: molten steel and conveyor rhythm, a busy cafeteria, and an assembly line that seemed to breathe. In the broader historical record, River Rouge became shorthand for American wartime mobilization, an emblem inscribed into newsreels and post-war studies. Its name was invoked in industrial textbooks and in conversations about vertical integration long after the flames cooled. Yet the legacy that mattered most to the former prisoners was less the industrial iconography than the personal fallout. How a day's observation could recalibrate a life's assumptions. Indefinido. The pilot's post-war career, insofar as records permit acknowledgement, turned toward technical instruction. He taught maintenance techniques that were paradoxically old-fashioned in method but modern in application. Kruger, once a tank commander accustomed to jury-rigging solutions, took up roles that emphasized systematic repair rather than improvised fixes. For men who had fought under scarcity, the River Rouge lesson was pragmatic. Where possible, design systems that reduce the need for improvisation. Back in the United States, the plant continued to be a subject of study. Engineers and managers at Ford used the wartime period to codify practices that would later feed into civilian production. The wartime imperative, keep the line moving, reduce changeover time, internalize critical supplies, translated into peacetime efficiency drives and the vocabulary of mass production. Workers who had contributed to the wartime surge found their skills in demand, and the plant's practices influenced industrial thinking across sectors. But the picture was not uniformly triumphant. The model of centralized, vertically integrated production had its critics even as it delivered wartime results. Detractors pointed to vulnerabilities, over-reliance on single plants, bottlenecks in particular processes, and the political risks of concentrated employment. These debates, which surfaced in policy and labor discussions, reminded observers that scale carried both strengths and new kinds of exposure. The prisoners' impression that a system that could rapidly replace losses altered the strategic balance was correct in part but needed nuance. Production was necessary, not sufficient, for victory. Within the camp, the ensuing months were a time of continued learning and slow transformation. The men attended lectures, passed around technical manuals, and occasionally staged small projects that mirrored the patterns they had observed. In one documented account, a group of prisoners in a workshop retooled a simple agricultural implement using a jig inspired by a visiting foreman's demonstration. The finished part, produced in succession and to tolerances, felt like a tiny reenactment of what they had seen at River Rouge. The act was as much psychological as practical. By organizing effort into repeatable tasks, the prisoners reclaimed a fragment of control. Not all the effects of the tour were technical. The experience left an imprint on how these men thought about truth and propaganda. Prior to Detroit, many had accepted, uncritically, narratives designed to simplify a complex war, that shortages were universal, that enemy morale was uniformly low. Confronted with empirical evidence, a plant's throughput, workers' steady meals, the arrangement of logistics, some prisoners developed a new intellectual caution. They learned to weigh propaganda against observation, to privilege verified data over rumor. That epistemological shift would shape post-war conversations for those who would later speak to journalists or teach in industrial schools. The intelligence reports that included the prisoners' observations fed into larger assessments. American analysts, reading across multiple inputs, production charts, aerial reconnaissance, shipping manifests, had already been constructing models that placed industrial capacity at the center of strategic planning. The prisoner's testimony added color and corroboration, a human confirmation of systems invisible from a map. For operational commanders, the lesson was uncomfortable, but actionable. It suggested that attritional strategies must be paired with efforts to disrupt production and logistics, and when feasible, to target choke points that could not be easily replaced. Yet even within strategic circles, the River Rouge case demonstrated limits. Factories could be bombed, supply lines could be interdicted, political will could erode. The plant's productivity was impressive, but it operated within a broader ecosystem of raw materials, transport, labor stability, and managerial cohesion. The prisoner's insight, that production could overwhelm localized tactical gains, was therefore neither a prophecy nor a fatalism. It was one variable among many. When the men were eventually repatriated, their reintegration was uneven. Some returned to civilian work that drew upon the competences they had seen and admired. Others drifted into unrelated fields, their wartime impressions an odd footnote in lives otherwise redirected by circumstance. Indefinido, the pilot's later writings, where extant mix technical curiosity with a reflective stance on modernity. One short entry, paraphrased in surviving notes, recounts standing under the white glare of molten metal and feeling, briefly, that he had witnessed something more than production, a new grammar of collective action that could reshape nations. Whether that grammar was benign or coercive, he did not claim to decide. He wrote only that the visibility of process had altered his calculus. There were, too, stories of personal reconciliation and small gestures that underscored the human side of the encounter. A former POW who later returned to the United States as a civilian visitor recounted, years afterward, attending a factory reunion where old hands still spoke affectionately of the cafeteria ladies who had served them during the rush. These anecdotes do not diminish the geopolitical stakes. They remind us that industry, like war, is lived by people whose daily acts confound clean narratives. River Rouge's public image evolved as well. Newsreels and magazines used it as shorthand for mobilization. Textbooks referenced its organization in chapters about wartime production. At the same time, scholars probed its limits, comparing it to dispersed production models and questioning the sustainability of hyper-centralized plants. These debates mattered because they shaped post-war industrial policy, how nations would balance scale with resilience, specialization with redundancy. In the final analysis, the prisoner's River Rouge visit stands less as a story about a single factory than as a lesson in the power of empirical observation to unsettle comfortable narratives. They had boarded a bus with assumptions planted by frontline experience and political messaging. They left with a set of numbers and a feeling, the recognition that modern conflict was as much about systems as it was about courage. The arithmetic they recorded did not eliminate battlefield skill or the moral complexity of war. It reframed how such skill could be leveraged and how losses could be absorbed. On a cold evening after the tour, Indefinido the pilot sat in a dim corner of the camp library and drafted what would become a short, hesitant entry in his private notes. Paraphrased in later accounts, his words suggested an astonishment that was not celebratory but analytic, that war had entered a new phase where the ability to organize, to standardize, and to subject labor to the discipline of flow could determine whether altitudes of sacrifice translated into strategic advantage. He did not claim that machines alone won wars. Rather, he recognized that machines multiplied choice. The prisoner's story, retold in debriefs and memoirs, became part of a larger historiography that treats industrial capacity as a decisive factor in 20th century warfare. Yet the human core of the narrative, men of different backgrounds under guard, watching a factory speak in numbers, remains its most compelling aspect. Their faces, the tactile surprise of cool benches and warm cafeterias, the quiet arithmetic penned on small notebooks, these are the details that bridge the technical and the humane. As an emblem of that moment, the River Rouge tour shows how exposure changes perception. It forces us to ask, what assumptions do we carry into encounters with complexity? How often do numbers, when made visible, outpace slogans and reveal hidden levers of power? For the 73 men from Fort Wayne, the answers arrived in the form of presses and conveyors, molten metal, and a bomber's skeletal frame. The shock promised in a headline was not a lurid revelation but a sober reorientation. Their enemy possessed not merely machines but a coordinated capacity to renew the instruments of war at a tempo many had not imagined. In closing, the story of those prisoners and the River Rouge tour is a reminder that wartime narratives hinge on systems as much as on singular acts. The visit did not convert the prisoners morally or politically. It educated them empirically. It taught a lesson that would echo into post-war reconstruction efforts and industrial debates. Scale without coordination is noise. Coordination multiplied across resources is power. If this account altered your sense of the war's machinery, share it with someone who loves history. And if you want more deep dives into untold WW2 moments, subscribe and watch our next video on how industrial logistics shaped the air campaigns over Europe. Which detail surprised you most? The molten pores, the bomber per hour, or the cafeteria that felt like steady reassurance? Tell us below.